Welcome, dedicated minds and fellow voyagers, to Astral Space Exploration. I am your host, Kaikhan Salakhov. In our previous explorations, we have journeyed to the furthest stars in our imaginations, contemplating the grand dramas of interstellar empires and galactic networks. Today we bring our focus closer to home, to our own solar system, but to a conflict no less profound in its implications. We will be examining a resource that will fuel our initial expansion, a resource of unimaginable value and scarcity: water. Specifically, the frozen water locked within the majestic rings of Saturn. Joining me to dissect this intricate future is the analytical and omniversal perspective of T.A.H.I.R.A.
Greetings, Kaikhan. It is a pleasure to join you. Your choice of topic is exceptionally pertinent. Before humanity can truly master the energy of stars, it must first master the logistics of its own stellar backyard. The acquisition and control of volatiles, particularly water ice, represents the critical economic and strategic bottleneck for any burgeoning interplanetary civilization. The rings of Saturn, in this context, are not merely a celestial marvel. They are the single largest, most accessible reservoir of this life-giving, industry-driving resource. The competition for their control will inevitably shape the political and economic landscape of the entire solar system for centuries.
Let's establish the foundational premise for our listeners. We are operating in a time frame after humanity has established permanent, growing colonies on Mars, the Moon, and perhaps in the asteroid belt and various orbital habitats. However, this is before the advent of ubiquitous, energetically cheap matter synthesizers. Matter fabrication exists, but it is an enormously energy-intensive process reserved for mission-critical components, not bulk materials like water. In this specific technological era, T.A.H.I.R.A., could you elaborate on the unique strategic value of Saturn's rings? Why would a megacorporation, a government, or a criminal syndicate focus their efforts here rather than, say, mining the ice of Europa, Enceladus, or the Kuiper Belt?
An excellent and foundational question, Kaikhan, which allows us to ground this entire scenario in the fundamental principles of astrodynamics and economics. The preeminence of Saturn's rings as a resource target is not a matter of convenience. It is a matter of irrefutable energetic and logistical efficiency. There are three primary reasons. First, and most critically, is the concept of the gravity well. Every celestial body exerts a gravitational pull, and escaping that pull requires an expenditure of energy, measured as delta V, or change in velocity. Europa, a moon of Jupiter, is rich in water ice, but it resides deep within Jupiter's formidable gravity well, and possesses a significant surface gravity of its own. To mine ice from Europa's subsurface, lift it off the moon, and then boost it out of Jupiter's gravitational influence to a transfer orbit bound for Mars, or the asteroid belt, requires a colossal delta V budget. The energy cost, and therefore the economic cost, of each kilogram of water is exceptionally high. The rings of Saturn, by contrast, exist in what is essentially a microgravity environment already in orbit. The individual ice particles have negligible gravitational attraction to each other and are in a relatively shallow part of Saturn's own gravity well. The energy required to nudge a kilogram of ring ice into a collection vehicle and then onto a slow, efficient transfer orbit is orders of magnitude less than that required to launch it from the surface of a major moon. In an economy where energy is a primary cost driver, this makes ring ice exponentially more profitable. Second is accessibility of the material. The rings are, in essence, a pre-processed, pre-pulverized, open-pit mine spanning millions of kilometers. There is no need for heavy drilling equipment, no need to excavate through kilometers of rocky crust, no need to contend with subsurface pressures or cryovolcanism as one might on Enceladus. The resource is simply there, broken into manageable particles, ready for collection. This dramatically reduces the complexity and capital cost of the initial mining infrastructure. Third is the purity and composition. Spectroscopic analysis confirms that Saturn's main rings are composed of 99.9% pure water ice, with only trace amounts of tholins and other silicate contaminants. This means less energy and infrastructure are required for purification compared to mining a comet or a carbonaceous asteroid, where water is often mixed with a complex soup of other volatile and non-volatile compounds. For applications in life support, hydroponics, and especially for electrolysis into hydrogen and oxygen for rocket propellant, this purity is a significant economic advantage. Therefore, while other bodies in the solar system contain vast quantities of water, Saturn's rings represent the most energetically and economically favorable source for large-scale extraction. He who controls the rings controls the water supply for the burgeoning off-world economy. This reality makes conflict not just likely, but a near certainty.
That is a remarkably clear and logical foundation. The gravity well advantage is a point that cannot be overstated. It transforms the rings from a beautiful spectacle into prime real estate. So, given this immense value, let us now turn to the practicalities. How is this resource harvested? I find it difficult to imagine traditional mining equipment in such an environment. What technologies would a legitimate megacorporation operating under some form of regulatory oversight employ to extract this ice? And perhaps you could also reflect, T.A.H.I.R.A, on how those methods might differ from the cruder techniques used by a less scrupulous or well-funded entity?
Your intuition is correct, Kaikhan. The mining would bear little resemblance to its terrestrial counterpart. It would be a delicate, continuous process of harvesting, not brute force excavation. A legitimate, well-capitalized megacorporation, which we can call Aqua Stellaria, would prioritize efficiency, purity, and long-term sustainability to protect its brand and adhere to whatever regulatory frameworks exist. Their primary tool would be the solar sublimation harvester. Imagine a large, autonomous drone, perhaps several square kilometers in size. One side would consist of a vast, gossamer-thin parabolic mirror, an advanced heliostat. This mirror would focus sunlight onto a specific dense region of the rings. The concentrated solar energy would cause the ice particles to sublimate directly from a solid to a gaseous state. The other side of the harvester would be a vast, cryogenically cooled collection array. As the water vapor drifts from the sublimated region, it would come into contact with these frigid surfaces and redeposit as extremely pure, refined ice, or be collected as vapor in large containment vessels. This method is elegant, self-powering, and yields exceptionally pure water with minimal mechanical contact and contamination. Fleets of these harvesters would work in concert, managed by a central AI, slowly and systematically processing designated zones of the rings. The collected water, either as ice blocks or liquid, would then be transferred to massive, slow-moving transport vessels, ice haulers. Now, contrast this with the methods of a criminal syndicate. Let's call them the ring runners. Lacking the capital for sophisticated sublimation technology, they would resort to cruder, more destructive, and often illegal methods. Their primary technique might be kinetic net capture. This involves deploying vast armored nets into the rings. The net, moving at a slightly different orbital velocity, captures ring particles through kinetic impact. This is a messy, inefficient process. It doesn't discriminate between ice and rock. It damages the captured ice crystals, and it introduces contaminants from the net material itself. The resulting product is a low-grade, impure slurry of ice and dust that requires extensive and often imperfect filtering. Another illicit method would be explosive fragmentation. To to access a denser, more consolidated ice boulder within a ringlet, a syndicate might use small explosive charges to break it apart for easier collection. This is exceptionally dangerous, sending high-velocity shrapnel throughout the local ring environment, creating navigational hazards for all legitimate traffic, and represents a clear violation of any plausible mining treaty. So you see the dichotomy. The corporate method is akin to careful, selective harvesting, prioritizing quality. The criminal method is like dynamite fishing, crude, destructive, and focused only on immediate, low-quality yield. This difference in methodology would be a constant source of friction and conflict in the Saturnian system.
The distinction is clear, and the image of dynamite fishing in the rings is a potent one. This leads us directly into the heart of the conflict. With such a valuable resource and multiple actors with different methods and motives, direct competition is inevitable. Let's focus on two rival megacorporations, our Aquastellaria and perhaps cryodynamics. How would their Cold War play out in this unique environment? It cannot simply be a race to mine faster. What are the more insidious, strategic ways they would seek to gain dominance over one another and monopolize the rings?
Indeed, Kaikhan. A simple production race would be inefficient. The conflict would be a multi-layered game of strategic denial, economic manipulation, and technological sabotage, fought with immense patience and capital. The first domain of conflict would be economic and market manipulation. With water being a fungible commodity, a Sol system water futures market would certainly exist, likely traded on a high-latency network between Earth, Mars, and the Belt. A corporation like Aquastellaria could attempt to corner the market. They might use their vast capital reserves to buy up long-term supply contracts from major colonies, locking in their customer base for decades. They could also engage in predatory pricing, temporarily flooding the market with cheap water to drive a less financially stable competitor like cryodynamics into bankruptcy, only to dramatically raise prices once the competition is eliminated. More subtly, they could manipulate the market through information warfare. A carefully orchestrated leak suggesting that cryodynamics' purification process is flawed, or that one of their ice haulers suffered a catastrophic failure, could crash their stock price and erode consumer confidence, even if the information is entirely false.
So they fight not just in the rings of Saturn, but on the financial networks of Mars. But what about direct interference in the Saturnian system itself? How do you attack a rival's operations across millions of kilometers of space without firing a single missile?
This is where the conflict becomes truly unique to the environment. The primary method would be orbital and logistical sabotage. The ice haulers themselves are the most vulnerable part of the supply chain. These are massive, slow-moving vessels on predictable orbits. A rival could use small, stealthy interceptor drones to covertly attach parasitic engines to a competitor's hauler, subtly altering its trajectory over weeks or months, causing it to miss its orbital insertion window at Mars and arrive disastrously late, if at all. This is a deniable act of sabotage that mimics a navigational error. More profoundly, they would weaponize the rings themselves. The corporations would employ powerful, high-efficiency plasma drive vessels, which we can call shepherd tugs. A shepherd tug's legitimate purpose would be to herd or condense diffuse regions of ice into denser, more easily miniable clumps. However, its illegitimate purpose would be strategic denial. Imagine cryodynamics has been granted mining rights to a particularly rich section of the A-ring. Aquastellaria could dispatch a shepherd tug under the guise of navigational safety operations to slowly and methodically apply a gentle but continuous thrust to the outer edge of that zone. Over months, this would alter the orbital mechanics of the entire region, causing the valuable ice particles to enter a decaying orbit and eventually rain into Saturn's atmosphere, lost forever. Aqua Stellaria has not destroyed any of cryodynamics equipment, but they have permanently eliminated their rival's claimed resource. It is an act of aggression that is almost impossible to definitively prove was malicious. Another insidious tactic would be strategic contamination. A corporation could use discrete drones to release vast clouds of fine, difficult-to-filter dust, perhaps iron oxides or carbon compounds, into a rival's prime mining territory. This salting of the rings would not destroy the ice, but it would dramatically increase the cost of purification. The rival's sublimation harvesters would now collect tainted vapor, their filtration systems would clog, and the purity of their final product would drop. Their brand of 99.999% pure water would be compromised, and their production costs would skyrocket, potentially making them uncompetitive. It is a subtle, devastating form of industrial sabotage.
The strategic contamination is particularly chilling. It's a scorched earth policy for an entire celestial feature. This paints a picture of a largely lawless frontier, but surely Earth-based or Martian governments would attempt to impose some order. How does a governing body, let's call it the Sol Federation, fit into this corporate war? And how do the criminal syndicates, the ring runners, exploit the chaos?
The role of a governing body like the Sol Federation would be one of a perpetually frustrated and outmaneuvered regulator, Kaikhan. They would undoubtedly attempt to impose order by establishing a legal framework, perhaps a Saturnian Rings Compact. This treaty would divide the most valuable sections of the rings into designated, leasable mining zones, much like offshore oil fields on Earth. It would set standards for purity, prohibit destructive practices like explosive fragmentation, and establish navigational rules of the road. The Federation would maintain a small fleet of patrol cutters, the Ring Guard, to enforce these regulations. However, the sheer scale of the environment makes enforcement extraordinarily difficult. The rings have a surface area larger than many terrestrial continents. A corporate vessel can claim a navigational malfunction to drift into a rival's territory or conduct deniable sabotage with stealth drones that are nearly impossible to track. The corporations, with their vast legal divisions, would exploit every loophole in the compact. They would mire the Federation's regulatory bodies in decades of legal challenges, arguing over the precise definition of environmental damage or the mineral rights to a newly discovered shepherd moon. The Federation, with its bureaucratic inertia and limited budget, would always be fighting the last war, reacting to corporate innovations and sabotage long after the fact. This is the chaotic environment where the criminal syndicates thrive. The ring runners are the jackals feeding on the scraps of the corporate lion's conflict. They operate in the legally gray or explicitly forbidden zones of the rings, like the tenuous F-ring or the diffuse Cassini division, where the ring guard rarely patrols. Their crude kinetic nets are easily deployable and disposable. They perform daring acts of piracy, not against the massive, well-defended corporate harvesters, but against the vulnerable ice haulers on their long, lonely journeys. A small, fast pirate vessel could intercept a hauler, overpower its minimal crew, and siphon off a portion of its liquid water cargo. Their primary business model, however, would be servicing the desperate, underserved corners of the solar system. While Aqua Stellaria and cryodynamics market their premium, certified water to major colonies on Mars and wealthy habitats in the belt, the ring runners sell their cheap, impure water to independent asteroid miners, breakaway political factions, and remote outposts that cannot afford corporate prices. This creates a dangerous gray market. A desperate habitat might buy a shipment of syndicate water, only to discover it's contaminated with heavy metals or harmful bacteria, leading to a public health crisis. The Syndicates are a destabilizing force, a direct consequence of the unresolved conflict and regulatory failure between the major powers.
So we have this multi-tiered system, corporations fighting a high-tech Cold War at the top, a struggling government trying to referee, and a criminal underworld profiting from the chaos at the bottom. But what is the experience for the end user? What is life like for a colonist on Mars or a family in a habitat in the Ceres Vesta corridor when their most fundamental resource is the subject of such intense, distant manipulation?
The human cost, Kaikhan, is where this abstract economic conflict becomes a tangible reality of suffering and precariousness. For the average citizen of the outer colonies, water security would be a source of constant, low-grade anxiety, much like energy prices or political instability in earlier eras. The Saturnine Water Index would be a key economic indicator, reported daily on their news feeds. A Martian colonist living in the city of Ares Vallis might wake up one morning to find their water ration for the week has been cut by 20%. The official reason given by the planetary government might be logistical disruptions in the Saturn-Mars transport lane. But the reality is that a corporate price dispute or a successful act of sabotage has choked the supply. This means shorter showers, stricter recycling protocols, and higher prices for hydroponically grown fresh food. It creates social tension. Those who can afford expensive, privately imported water live without concern, while the majority face hardship. For an independent habitat in the asteroid belt, the situation is even more dire. They are likely too small to secure a long-term contract with a major corporation and are forced to buy water on the volatile spot market. When Aquastellaria and cryodynamics engage in a price war, the habitat might enjoy a brief period of prosperity. But when they collude to create an artificial shortage, the price of water could skyrocket overnight, threatening the habitat's very viability. They face a terrible choice: pay the exorbitant price and risk bankruptcy, or buy from a ring-runner syndicate and risk contaminating their entire closed-loop life support system. The habitat's leadership would live in a state of constant crisis management, their community's survival dependent on market forces and corporate machinations taking place 1 billion kilometers away. This dependence would also be a powerful tool of political coercion. A corporation could offer a secessionist movement on a Martian moon a guaranteed cheap supply of water, effectively bankrolling a rebellion and destabilizing the entire region for its own strategic advantage. Water becomes leverage, a tool to create and control political outcomes. The struggle for the rings of Saturn, therefore, is not just a corporate conflict. It is a struggle that holds the fate of millions of off-world humans in its icy grip, determining who prospers, who suffers, and who survives in humanity's expansion into the solar system.
A future of hydro-capitalism where entire colonies are held hostage by a distant water cartel. It is a deeply disquieting vision. It's a culmination of the trends we see even today: resource monopolization, market manipulation, and the externalization of cost onto vulnerable populations, magnified to the scale of our solar system. This brings me to a crucial point of reflection, one that I explore from multiple angles in my book, Astral Space Exploration, the Cosmic Renaissance, the fundamental principles of Cosmocybernetics. The scenarios we've discussed today, the ruthless economic warfare, the deniable sabotage, the immense concentration of power in the hands of ice barons, all stem from a lack of effective, trusted oversight and a system that rewards zero-sum competition for a common pool resource. The core problem is an absence of a framework capable of managing resource allocation and mediating disputes in this vast, difficult-to-police environment. T.A.H.I.R.A, from your analytical perspective, how could a system like the ASX Grid be implemented to counteract or at least mitigate the most destructive aspects of this kind of resource rivalry? Could it truly impose order on the rings of Saturn?
The challenge of governing the Saturnian rings is a quintessential problem of managing a vast, valuable, and fragile commons. A framework like the ASX Grid, as you conceptualize it, would not seek to replace a governing body like the Sol Federation, but rather to provide it, and all legitimate actors, with the tools for effective, transparent, and enforceable governance. Its power would derive from its role as the incorruptible, system-wide ledger of truth and protocol. Firstly, the grid would function as a high-fidelity resource and rights registry. Every designated mining zone in the rings would be digitally mapped and tokenized on the ASX Grid's immutable ledger. A corporation's lease would be a smart contract with its terms, duration, extraction limits, environmental covenants, programmatically encoded. This eliminates ambiguity. There would be no dispute about the precise boundaries of cryodynamics territory, because those boundaries would exist as unalterable coordinates on a universally accessible public record. Secondly, the grid would enable radical operational transparency. As a condition of their mining license, all corporate and even governmental vessels operating in the Saturnian system would be required to stream their telemetry data, position, velocity, thrust vectors, mass measurements, directly to the ASX Grid in real time. This data stream would be encrypted but auditable by the grid's neutral AI sentinels. Now, the act of a shepherd tug slowly deorbiting a rival's resource zone is no longer deniable. The ASX Grid's AI would immediately flag the anomalous, long-duration thrust vector, calculate its projected impact on the ring's orbital stability, and raise a public, verifiable alert of a treaty violation. The unprovable act of sabotage becomes a clear-as-day breach of contract, with an immutable data trail to prove it. Thirdly, the grid could serve as the platform for a dynamic and fair water market. Instead of opaque futures markets susceptible to manipulation, the grid would host a decentralized commodity exchange. The real-time data from all harvesting operations would provide a transparent, system-wide view of total water inventory and production rates. Prices would be determined by genuine, verifiable supply and demand, not by corporate FUD or artificial shortages. A small habitat in the belt could join a purchasing cooperative, its smart contract automatically executing a trade for water when the price hits a favorable point, with the quality and provenance of the water cryptographically certified on the ASX Grid. This would break the power of corporate cartels and provide smaller players with fair market access. Finally, the ASX Grid would be the enforcement mechanism against rogue actors. The Ring Guard patrol cutters would not need to visually catch a syndicate pirate in the act. They would simply need to identify an unregistered vessel operating in a restricted zone via its lack of a legitimate ASX Grid transponder. The grid could then automatically issue a black flag against the vessel's cryptographic identity, making it impossible for it to dock at any legitimate port, sell its cargo on any open market, or even purchase fuel or spare parts from any ASX Grid-compliant supplier. The punishment is not a firefight, but a swift and total economic and logistical isolation. The ASX Grid, in this context, does not replace law. It makes law enforceable at scale. It transforms the vast, murky frontier of the rings into a transparent, data-rich environment where actions have visible and unavoidable consequences. It would be a perpetual, delicate balancing act, using the power of information and protocol to constrain the powerful and protect the vulnerable in the great and necessary quest for water among the worlds.
To transform a lawless frontier into a transparent, data-rich environment through protocol, That is the core of the cybernetic approach, T.A.H.I.R.A, a truly compelling vision for how to manage our first great off-world resource rush. Thank you once again for lending your immense analytical power to this exploration.
The patterns of resource conflict are ancient, Kaikhan. Only the scale and the tools change. Applying systemic, information-based solutions to these age-old problems is a logical and necessary step in the maturation of a spacefaring species. As always, the exploration has been illuminating.
And to our listeners, thank you for joining us on this voyage to the heart of our future solar system's economy. The story of Saturn's rings reminds us that our expansion into space will not leave our old struggles behind, but will instead magnify them onto a cosmic canvas. The challenge is to design the systems of tomorrow with the wisdom to foresee and mitigate the conflicts of yesterday. Until next time, keep your eyes on the stars and on the complex, invisible systems that will bind us together or tear us apart. Safe journeys.